Hey, everybody. So, we're going to get into, or I guess I should say, continue talking about George Washington's first term as president. And we're going to look today at the country's finances. Okay. And we'll talk about how Alexander Hamilton was the guy that George Washington put in charge of the country's finances. But first, we have all of one focus question to write down. So pause this, write that down, and hopefully we're back. So here's the deal: is we are a brand new country. Okay, George Washington is just brand new president, and there were a bunch of issues, problems that the country had that George Washington had to address. One of those was the country was in debt, and you probably guess where the debt came from is we just got done fighting for independence from Great Britain. We know wars are super expensive, and so that bill was coming due and had to figure out a way how to pay for it. So what Washington did is a guy named Alexander Hamilton is who he put in charge of getting the country out of debt. And so Alexander Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury, right? So now this is the cabinet positions. One of them, the executive departments. And so we had Treasury, which was money, State, which was our interactions with other country, and War, which was the department that dealt with the country's defense. So Alexander Hamilton put in charge of the Department of the Treasury, which made him the Secretary of the Treasury. And George Washington's instruction to him was get the country out of debt. That's your job. Okay, that's what George Washington wanted Hamilton to do. So just to kind of put this into perspective, in the United States in 1789, so when this is all kind of happening, we owed $53 million, right? That was what the country owed, $53 million in 1789. Just as sort of a comparison for fun, is today the country continues to be in debt, and we owe $27 trillion today. So 1789, we were in the millions, we've blown right through the billions, and now we're sitting in the trillions, 27 trillion. So we've got, just again, sort of for fun, maybe it's not fun, but right about 330 million people live in the United States. So each citizens, 330 million citizens, I should say. So each citizen's share of that 27 trillion is about $82,000. So all 330 million of us to pay off that debt would have to write a check for $82,000. So that's a lot. So two terms here you could probably write down. That first one I should have said already was national debt. So that's the amount of money owed by the U.S. to its lenders. So that's the amount of money that the country owes. The next term is bonds. So again, you should write these down. Bonds are certificates that represent money owed. Now, what happened with the Revolutionary Wars, one of the ways that they paid for it was the government would sell these bonds, they call them like war bonds, to just citizens during the Revolutionary War. And so let's say they sold a bond for $10. And what the deal was is you would give the government $10. They would give you this bond, and the government then would use that $10 to help fight the Revolutionary War, buy bullets and rifles and food and whatever they needed. Then the deal was later, when you came back to turn in your bond, they would pay you back that $10, but plus some interest. So, let's say you turned it in and they gave you back $11. So you basically borrowed them money, borrowed the government money, and then they paid you back more money. That's the idea behind a bond. So certificates that represent money owed. Now here's what Alexander Hamilton did. So he had a 5-part plan. Okay, and number one, he said we need to pay back foreign debt right away. So money that the United States had borrowed from, say, France or other places or other citizens of other countries was about just under $12 million. So he said, that's our number one priority. We want to pay that off immediately, right? So make other countries look at us as though, if they borrow us money, they're confident that we'll pay it back. So that's number one, pay back foreign debt immediately, about $12 million that was. Now the second is where we get to these bonds. And this was payback bond holders over time. And a lot of these people then would be American citizens. Okay, so he says we're paying back foreign debt right away, number one priority. Then secondly is these bond holders. We're going to have to pay those back over time. So the idea was that if you had one of these bonds, Alexander Hamilton said, the plan is we're going to pay you back, just not quite yet. So hang on to it and we will pay you back, but you're going to have to hold on for a little while. Now this is where Alexander Hamilton starts to develop this rivalry with Thomas Jefferson. Now both of these guys were in President Washington's cabinet. Alexander Hamilton was in charge of Treasury, like we're saying, and Thomas Jefferson was in charge of the Department of State. Okay, so he was our first Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury, and they became political rivals. So they very often had different opinions on things. And this was one of those things that they had a different opinion on. So Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, the question here was with these bonds. Okay, now people bought the bonds with the hope that those bonds would get paid back later. People started to, as time went on, people started to think the government is never going to pay back this bond. So if you have a bond that says the government owes you $10, but you have no confidence that the government is actually going to pay you back that $10, then that bond sort of becomes worthless to you, right? If somebody gives you an IOU and you have no expectation that they're going to pay you back that IOU, then that IOU has no value. So what was happening is there were these people, and here's another term for you, called speculators. And these were people who would go to these bondholders and they would offer to buy that bond for less than face value. Okay, so basically they were gambling that the government would in fact eventually pay that bond back. So if you had a $10 bond, maybe one of these speculators would come up and say, I see you've got this $10 bond that you bought, during the Revolutionary War, and you kind of don't think anybody's going to pay that back. So what I'll do is for that $10 bond, I'll give you $1. You turn that bond over to me, it becomes mine, I give you the dollar. And now if you're somebody who doesn't think that you're ever going to get your $10 out of that bond, some guy coming in and saying, I'll give you $1 for it, you're going to look at that and say, well, I guess $1 is better than nothing, so yes, I will sell you this bond for $1. And the speculator is basically gambling. So a couple things can happen for the speculator. Number one is maybe that bond never gets paid off, and then he spent $1 for a worthless bond. But if that bond ultimately does get paid off, then he's hit the jackpot. He paid $1 for something that's going to be worth $10. And so that was the gamble. So the speculators were gambling that those bonds would in fact get paid off. And the original bondholders were sort of gambling too that those bonds would never get paid off. And so they would take whatever money they can out of it. Now, Alexander Hamilton said about the speculators, we should pay him. Okay? If a speculator holds a bond, we pay them what the bond was worth, because that speculator took the risk, and if they've got the bond, pay him. Thomas Jefferson said, no, we shouldn't pay these bondholders, because basically what they're doing is they're cheating the original bond holders, and they shouldn't be rewarded for that. Somebody comes in, a speculator comes in, finds a bondholder in a bad situation, and they needed money, and so paid them way less than a thing was worth. So Jefferson says, taking advantage of them, and we shouldn't reward them for that, because what's happening is you're getting these bondholders who were in Jefferson's view, basically stealing money from poor people. Okay, so we shouldn't reward them for that. Now, ultimately, what happens is George Washington has to decide, right? So they're sitting in a cabinet meeting. Secretary of Treasury says we should pay the bondholders, whether they're speculators or not. Thomas Jefferson says we should not, George Washington, pay these bondholders because they cheated, or these speculators because they cheated. And George Washington's president, so he hears both of these guys out. Ultimately, he decides, and what he decides is he's going to go with what Hamilton said. Okay, so he tells Jefferson, sorry, not doing what you want. So if we're keeping score here, we've got Hamilton with 1 and Jefferson with 0. All right, next part of Hamilton's plan was that the states themselves owed money from the war. Individually, the states themselves owed money from the war. And Hamilton said, what we're going to do is we're going to have the federal government take on that debt from the states. So the states owe money. Let's take that debt from the states, and we will pay for it as the federal government. And some of the states thought this was the greatest plan ever, right? Like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. We borrowed all this money, and now we don't have to pay it back. This is perfect. Some states thought it was the worst idea that they'd ever heard, because some states had some debt from the war, but had already paid it off. Okay, so they had already paid off their debt. And when the federal government comes in and says, we're going to take on the debt of all of the states, what that means ultimately is that the states that paid off their debt are going to have to pay another share of the other states' debt when the federal government takes it, takes that debt on. And they said, that's a terrible idea. So we worked hard and paid off our debt. Now you want us together, kind of cumulatively, to pay off the debt of the other states? They said, this is a terrible idea. And the way that it worked out is in the southern states, that was where most of the states were that had actually paid off their debts already, the southern states. So kind of the South as a whole said, this is actually a terrible idea. We don't want to do this. And so Alexander Hamilton kind of had to figure out a way to get the South to agree to this. And so what he did is he thought, well, what's something that's important to the South that I could kind of use as a bargaining chip? And what the South was looking for is the capital was in New York, which is pretty far north. Okay, and the southern states wanted the capital to be more centralized. Okay, more sort of in the middle. They didn't want the capital so far north. So what Hamilton said is he said, okay, here's what we're going to do, South, is if you agree to my plan to, kind of support this plan that we're going to have the federal government take over the debts from what worked out to be the northern states. If you agree to do that, then what we'll do is we will actually move the capital out of New York, and we'll move it to a place farther south. That place farther south turned out to be Washington, D.C., which did not exist. Washington, D.C. was just sort of like swamps, right? There was not a city there. So the idea was that they will build a new city farther south and make that the U.S. capital, which is what then the South said, okay, we will agree to that. And so they temporarily moved the capital from New York City to Philadelphia, and then started the process of actually building the city of Washington, D.C. Now, Jefferson, kind of going back to our disagreement between Hamilton and Jefferson, is Jefferson didn't like this idea of the federal government taking on the debt of the states. Because what he said, basically, was that this is going to make the federal government more powerful. Okay? As if it takes on the debt of the states, then by doing that, it takes some power from the states, because the states aren't operating independently anymore. They're kind of beholden to the federal government. So he didn't like that either, but just like before, Washington agreed with Hamilton, and they did it. Okay, now as far as economy as a whole, Hamilton and Jefferson also had different ideas. Hamilton wanted to have a country based on manufacturing and business. He was big into, like, we need to look like Great Britain, and we need to use the federal government to make this happen. We need to make the federal government finance, give loans to places that want to start businesses and factories. We need to pass tariffs, which we'll talk about in a minute, to help protect American manufacturing. So we want to kind of design the country to be a country that focuses on, business, manufacturing. We want to look like Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson said, nope, that is exactly not what we should do. Is we should have a country that is based on agriculture. Jefferson would say the freest people are people that own their own land and farm their own land, and that's the kind of the freest, most independent people would be landowners that farmed. And he said, so that's what we should have. Didn't think the government should get involved in helping businesses grow. Again, because that wasn't what he thought the country should be. Didn't want us to be a manufacturing country, wanted us to be an agricultural country. Okay, so that's where this next part of Hamilton plan creates another disagreement between Jefferson and Hamilton, and that was to pass up what's called a protective tariff. And what a protective tariff does is it takes and it puts a tax on any goods coming into the U.S. So this little graphic here sort of explains it. So in these days, Great Britain was the best country as far as manufacturing goes. They could produce stuff, the cheapest out of anybody. So in Great Britain, in this little graphic here, we've got a roll of cloth that the British can produce and get to the United States and sell for $4 a roll. Okay? In the United States, an American company can produce that and sell it for $4.25 a roll, right? So if you walk into a store in the United States, before this tariff, you'd see a pile of cloth for $4 a roll. You'd see a pile of cloth for $4.25 a roll. Most people, if they're sort of same quality, are going to buy the cheaper roll. Okay, so British companies were producing this cloth, selling it in the United States. American companies producing their cloth, they weren't selling as much because it was more expensive, and people would buy the cheaper priced stuff. So that did not help these American companies grow because people weren't buying their stuff. So what Alexander Hamilton says is, let's put a tariff on British stuff coming in, stuff coming in from other countries. So in the graphic here, you've got a 25% tariff that gets added. Okay, so $4 roll, 25% tariff would be $1. That means that once the cloth got here, the British would have to sell it for $5 a roll instead of the $4 a roll. So now somebody walks into a store and they see two piles of rolls of cloth, one of them for $5, the other for $4.25. Most people are going to buy the cheaper roll, which this time would be the American-made stuff. So now American companies are selling more rolls of cloth, which means they have to produce more rolls of cloth, which means they have to hire more people to produce more rolls of cloth. And so it helps American companies grow. And Alexander Hamilton said, that's what we need to do. And the reason why is because higher tariffs are good for businesses, right? Because they sell more of their product. So tariffs are good generally for businesses. Thomas Jefferson says this is a bad idea because tariffs are bad for farmers generally. Because what happens then is the farmers, when they're buying the products and the things that they need to produce their crops, are more expensive, right? Say they needed a roll of cloth. Pre-tariff, they were paying $4. After the tariff, they were paying 4.25. So things were more expensive. They were still producing the same amount of their crop, and they were selling it for the same price. But now, to grow that crop, they're having to pay more money. So Jefferson says we shouldn't do this because it hurts farmers. Remembering that Jefferson wanted a country based on agriculture. So he says don't do things that hurt farmers, right? That's not going to get me where I want to go. So then George Washington has to look at it and he says, okay, so what do we want? A agricultural based country like Jefferson says, or a business manufacturing based country like Hamilton says? And we've kind of got a trend so far, and that trend is that Washington goes with Hamilton, which he did again. So if my scorecard is correct, we've got Hamilton for 3, Jefferson shut out for 0, as far as convincing Washington to do what he thinks he should do. All right. Then the last one here, that is the Bank of the United States. And the last part of Alexander Hamilton's plan was to create the Bank of the United States. And what he said here is the government, if we had a national bank, the government could deposit money in that bank. Now they were relying on state banks, which were generally not real secure. So if we had a bank that the U.S. government controlled, it'd be a safe place to deposit money. Then through that national bank, they could make loans to whoever they wanted to loan to, support businesses, do that kind of stuff easily through their bank. Alexander Hamilton felt like it would create more security for the country. Again, because the state banks were sort of unreliable. And so if you had a secure place to deposit money and run your finances through, said that would be better. And I'll spoil the surprise, they did create the bank. So it was created in 1791. Now, here was the issue. 2 terms that we had on our terms and people, loose construction versus strict construction. And Alexander Hamilton, he liked this idea of loose construction. And what loose construction was, is it was with the Constitution that even if the Constitution doesn't specifically give the federal government the power to do something, Alexander Hamilton says that maybe we probably can still do it. So his favorite part of the Constitution would have been the elastic clause, right? Let's stretch the power of the federal government. The Constitution, nowhere in it says that the federal government can create a bank. Okay? So based off of that, shouldn't have been able to do it. And that's what Jefferson said with your other term, strict construction, where he says strict construction, if the Constitution doesn't say it, we can't do it, which means the Constitution does not say we can make a bank, so Jefferson says we can't make a bank. Hamilton says, well, yeah, we can make a bank. Loose construction versus strict construction. So he goes to George Washington, and they're discussing this again. And George Washington says, well, what do you think? Hamilton says, Constitution doesn't say we can, but we still can. Thomas Jefferson says, Constitution doesn't say we can make a bank, so we can't make a bank. George Washington looks at it and he says, we're making a bank. So again, he goes with Alexander Hamilton's plan over the concerns of Thomas Jefferson, and we created a national bank. And we'll talk this. The national bank actually becomes kind of an issue over time that we will talk about. So you'll hear more about this national bank, and that is where we stop. So see you later.